welcome back to Invisible UX. Today we'll continue our series on Figma tutorials with part 2 of the session on position and size. Enjoy. So moving on, we have the corner radius. So by default, you have a 0 corner radius, which means they're actually square edges at 90 degrees. As you increase the radius, you get a softer corner. So the current trend in UX and UI design is to have radii corners, so you get that kind of softer feel. Depends on the size of the component that you're looking at, but it usually looks something like that. To adjust the corner radii, as I've been doing, you can just kind of press and hold while hovering and get an idea. This would be more of a pill aesthetic, going all the way down to 0. You have your standard button almost to 0. Okay. And then you have the more typical look here. Okay. So it's really a ratio of like the level of rounding compared to the size of an object. So there's no rule of thumb that says it must be 10 radii or 10 pixels or 20 pixels or 30 pixel radii. It just depends on the size of the object. So what if you don't want all 4 corners to have the same radius? Typically, for most applications, for most designs, you would want consistent radii on all 4 corners. There are going to be exceptions to that. In that case, you're going to hover over this little button here. For independent corners, you're going to select it, and it's going to reveal individual controls for each of the corners. Okay, so just as an example, if you hover, we've got the upper left corner there. Now, if you want to go back to applying 1 radius to all 4 corners, you'll see this now says mixed because we have different radii. Double click, type in what you want, and it applies everything consistently. So there's one more feature here, the corner smoothing. Basically just has to do with finer detail for those corners. That especially applies as you zoom into that object. And then it shows you where iOS typically is there. So you get an idea of complete rounded, smoothing the edges out up here, and then pulling those edges even tighter. Pretty advanced stuff. Nothing, I've personally not really played with that very much in my personal experience. Okay, let's get to it. We're going to continue the design properties menu over here. We last left off with alignment, size, position, rotation, and corner radii. We're going to continue with constraints. So diving right in, we're going to delete these extra items and start off with just one shape within our frame. Okay, try to make that big so you can see. You can see by default, the left and top constraints are selected. Now, what are constraints? Constraints define how a particular object will move relative to the frame if the frame size is adjusted. Okay, what does that mean? So we go back to our rectangle. The top constraint and the left constraint are selected. You can take a minute, take a second, try to guess what's going to happen. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the bottom right corner. So remember the top left sides are constrained here. And the top and left spacing stays consistent. So it's essentially anchored, and you can see that by the blue lines here, to the left and to the top. So no matter how big or small this frame gets, that object never moves relative to the top and to the left. Okay? Now let's switch it up a little bit. Let's constrain the right side and the bottom side. Do you have any idea what's going to happen now? If we move that same corner, the right side and the bottom side are going to stay fixed, and the top and left are going to shrink. or grow. See? So it actually looks like the object is moving, but it's really just staying anchored to the right and bottom and then moving to the left and top. Okay? So what happens if you have center selected and bottom? Okay? We have this blue line, which is saying it's going to be anchored relative to the bottom. And then we also have this blue line saying it's going to be anchored to the center. So let's see. Yep, that space is constrained on the bottom. It stays consistent, but when we move left and right, it's centered. So let's look at something here, because it did look like it was a little off center, but that's because when we set the constraints, the object was a little bit off center. So if we move that side all the way to the right, it's going to get to the object closer than the left side. Again, if I hit undo, because this object is a little bit closer to the right. If I align that object to the center of the frame, now both sides should hit that object at the same time because it's centered, right? Because it's constantly being centered within the frame that's changing in size. Okay, so pretty self-explanatory if we do center for both top, bottom, left, right. And we'll go ahead and align that object to the vertical center so it's centered within the frame. Now it's constantly going to be centered no matter how the size of that object changes. Okay. The drop down here gives you the option of selecting left, right, or centered here. There's a couple more options there which are beyond the scope of this kind of introductory session. So similar with vertical, you have top, and bottom, center, or scale.